afternoon to everyone who's joined us so far. Thanks very much for jumping in. We're going to give the stragglers a minute or two to join us, and then we will get started. Hi again to everyone who's joined. Just 30 more seconds for anyone else to join that may be dialing in, and we will kick off. Okay, I think we're good to make a start. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for the next episode in our Zero Trust Threat series of webinars that we have going on this week. Very busy week, so I'm sure some of you have been in a couple of our other sessions. There's a few more going on throughout the week as well, so do be sure to check them out. But to refocus us to this afternoon's session then, I'm joined by myself, Toby Noble, a security business manager here at Bytes. We've also got my colleague Dara from Okta, who I promise I will introduce properly in just a moment. But to set the scene very briefly around modern identity and access management, what we're here to talk about today. Really in the light of zero trust and everything that means for us today, we're looking to explore the impact the difference in user behavior as we're seeing it today has on how we achieve zero trust across the business, with distributed workforces, threats rising on a daily basis, of course, and that all kind of leading to identity being essentially the new perimeter. So we're going to explore some of those topics, some of those challenges, and Dara's got a lot to say on the subject for sure. So without further ado, I'll very quickly go through the housekeeping and then on to the good stuff. So for this session, you'll probably notice already you are muted as you come in, and your camera's off. Feel free to put your camera on if you so wish, but please do stay muted for the session if you could. If you do have any questions along the way, feel free to chuck them in the chat box. We will absolutely address those in a dedicated Q&A section of the session towards the end. The session is being recorded. You will be sent a link to this recording as well. And should we get too many questions to deal with on today's session, we'll be more than happy to compile some responses for you, send them back off the alongside the link with the recording as well. But to emphasize, if you do have any questions along the way, do chuck them in the chat box. We'll also be keeping you on your toes with a few polls along the way as well, for which you'll be given a minute or so to respond to. So we'll keep it interactive. I hope you enjoy the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague Dara.
Great. Thanks for that, Toby. Hello, everyone. My name is Dara, part of the solutions engineering team at Okta. And typically it's my job to support the enterprise sales team in their role to help customers as far as solution design goes and helping with technical requirements in general.
Perfect. Thanks, Dara. Can I switch over to you to share your screen?
Yeah, sure. Happy to.
Perfect. I'll stop sharing 2 seconds.
Here we go. And bear with us. Yeah. Is that visible?
Got it. Perfect.
Great stuff. Great. So happy to kick things off whenever you're ready, Toby.
Perfect. Yes. So a lot of today's focus in today's session will be around a report that Okta have carried out. They call it the State of Zero Trust. And really what we're going to do today is just digest that into the core takeaways that we've highlighted from that report. And we'll talk you through those. Appreciate a lot of you wouldn't have read the report. So we'll highlight those key takeaways for you and I suppose just instigate a bit of a discussion around most of those. So if we look at the report in a whole, the first key takeaway that we'd like to highlight is around zero trust, to do with distributed working specifically. And I suppose in the post-COVID world, dare I say it, the renewed focus on flexible working, agile working, whatever you want to call it. But really what that highlights is what level of security risk is associated directly with that. And Dara, I was hoping you might be able to shed some light from your perspective on that subject.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Toby. So swapping over here, I think in order to be able to understand where we're going in terms of making businesses a lot more secure in a world that is being a lot more distributed in terms of how people are working these days, it starts off by understanding where we have been in terms of security and understand just where we're going eventually as well. And so typically in the past, how things were done were based a lot more, very much based around network being the perimeter. And on that basis, we had firewalls, we had VPNs, and typically that created some aspects of risk, which we could talk about today as well. But naturally, as that evolves and people are a lot more distributed, we're looking for new ways to be able to adapt to those types of changes and new ways to be able to recognize the kind of risks as they arise in order to be a bit more adaptable with how we authenticate users to secured resources within the business. So that's something that we can talk about here. So as I said, networks typically were the perimeter in the past, and that meant that if bad actors got access to trusted resources by breaking into that otherwise secured network perimeter, then they had access to everything. Essentially, that was the keys to the castle, so to speak. And so there is, in some sense, a focal point there, and that means it's a central point of failure. And with that central point of failure becomes an element of risk that, if we can have the opportunity, we want a way to eliminate or at least mitigate against. So Okta's approach to that is one that's a bit more based on being context aware. So as somebody authenticates to be able to access critical resources in the business, we want a way to be able to understand the context around that authentication request and make our access decisions based on the information we get there. And so just to allude to some of the things we'll speak about in more detail soon, it's about understanding things like whether a device is trusted or not. It's about understanding whether a device is on network or off network, whether there's a trusted IP that it's registered to, or you could even make those access decisions based on the geolocation of a user as well. So in terms of the risks of distributed working, the network perimeter based approach is one that has seen some limitations and one where the future of access requests are based on context that has the possibility of being a lot more secure.
Perfect. Thanks for that insight, Dara. So first poll of the day, get your fastest fingers ready. Michael, you might want to help me launch this one. So poll for today, what percentage roughly of your workforce is working remotely? I expect to see some fairly high numbers perhaps, although things do seem to be taking a bit of a shift as we go through the year for sure. I'll give you a minute to get those answers in. We're seeing a bit of a spread at the moment. So it's pretty even, to be honest, from what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing a very even spread across all of the options there, with a slight majority in the 25 to 49% bracket, which is probably what I'm seeing as well, certainly in the conversations I'm having with customers. Dara, any thoughts on that? Are you surprised?
No, I think as far as distributed working goes, it's a feature we're all getting used to. It's something that we've all adapted to and seem to enjoy, of course, as well. So it's working well. Just going to reshare there, sorry.
Perfect. So that leads us nicely on to the next section, actually, which is going to be takeaway 2 from the report, which states it's imperative for people and devices to be authenticated. Of course, if we're thinking about identity being the new perimeter, more and more people working from home, although we are starting to see a shift back to office-based working, but I think it's fair to say the majority of companies are working in some form of hybrid state at the moment. So the question is, if identity is the new perimeter, what does that mean to our defense and security posture? How do we need to adapt that, and what's actually being attacked now and how?
Sure. Well, good question. Well, it seems that to understand identity as the new perimeter, I think where that starts is by understanding what the existing risks to the legacy approach might have been, so that we have a baseline framework in order to improve upon that from there. So realistically, with the network perimeter-based approach, what we've been able to recognize is that credentials were typically the target. There's a few examples of how we've been able to discover those findings outlined here. For example, 70% of data breaches involve stolen or weak credentials, 91% of phishing attacks target credentials, and 51% of people end up reusing the same passwords. So it's with that understanding and expectation that allows us to understand that if we can find a way to reduce or completely eliminate passwords and replace those passwords with different factors instead, different factors of authentication, and that can lead to a much more secure business where on an application by application basis, we have the ability to adapt the kind of factors that we apply to be relevant and specific based on the level of assurance we need for each of those assets. So if we're to go a little step further there with that subject, attacks, when you think about the likes of malware or hacking, we think of something that can be a lot more complex than what a typical breach can involve. And typically attacks don't need to be difficult, because if you run a phishing campaign, you can get the credentials you need, and then it just is a matter of logging in order to get access to otherwise secure resources. And so a system that's a lot more based on context, treating identity as the perimeter and gathering as much information as we can to determine access requirements, that's going to provide a better level of assurance to businesses in order to secure their business assets. So to elaborate further, we've contextual access. And with that contextual access, that's where we take into account different aspects of information, different signals that we gather upon every single authentication request. And that can mean that whether it's an IP address when we're gathering network context, whether it's a new device authenticating from a user that that wasn't associated to that user before maybe, or whether it's a new location, like they're logging in London and then an hour later they're logging in New York, we can make access decisions with all that information. And with all that context, that can give us the ability to make the appropriate response so that only the right people have the right level of access at the right time. And so broadly speaking there, we've got two themes that are competing in some ways. One theme is focused around using user context associated with that identity in order to make access decisions. And the other is a little less adaptable in that it's simply using credentials. And if a bad actor has those credentials, they can log into what would otherwise be secured resources. So to summarize that part, Zero Trust is really all about being context aware, giving access to the right people and giving them the right level of access at the right time. And how we're able to do that is by interpreting the right signals, creating policies based on those signals, and determining whether or not we want to give access to specific applications at a specific time based on all that extra information. And when businesses think about that extra level of authentication, it would be natural to assume that it might introduce some friction, right? But in terms of how Okta approaches it, we don't want there to be a trade-off in either direction. If it's a matter of using credentials or using a substitute factor that is adapted based on the level of assurance that's required, that experience should maintain the same. And that's why when we're giving zero trust level of access to the right people at the right time, it's based on as little friction as possible. And so ultimately, how we characterize zero trust is based on three factors: a perimeterless design, context awareness, and dynamic access controls. And I'll go through these one by one just to elaborate a bit. With perimeterless design, traditionally you had that network perimeter-based approach, and instead of using that approach, what we're going to do is base our access decisions on each individual request, and that's where identity becomes the new perimeter. The context awareness point is about understanding the signals that we can gather to have as much information at our fingertips as we can possibly have to make the best access decision for each specific moment of authentication. And then as far as dynamic access control goes, we want the ability to be able to make those decisions dynamically and to have a way where the decisions can be automated, and maybe beyond fixed policies that a business sets up, how can we implement technology like risk scoring in order to automate those access decisions too.
Thanks, Dara. Some really good points in there, particularly around authentication, which, let's be honest, can mean a few different things to several different people. It could be something as simple as MFA. It could be that contextual access policies type piece as well, where you get a bit more intelligent around, I suppose, how and when MFA is triggered. So time for the next poll around authentication, which is: how confident are you that your current strategy authenticates people and devices effectively? Real mix of answers coming through again. I'll give you a few more seconds to get those in. So looks like we have a very modest audience today, Dara. Most people saying fairly confident there. Which is good to hear, I guess. You know, only a few saying not confident. Maybe we should have a chat after this session. And a couple saying very confident as well. I like your confidence there. It's very, very good. But that's good to see. I think, you know, a few of those questions, a few of those answers there may be a bit ambiguous in terms of how people should answer them. But good to see that most of our audience today are fairly confident in their current strategy. So well done to you all. On to the next section then. Now, there are a couple more takeaways that we're going to take away from Okta's Zero Trust report. And I'm going to bundle two into one now, because I think they complement each other very well. The first being that sophisticated zero trust has accelerated rapidly, which of course it's had to, with the state of the world now. That's driven that accelerated roadmaps in various technology areas, and from a business perspective, it's driven that adoption of technologies. We're seeing that a lot, and I'm sure some of our customers are experiencing that as well. And another takeaway, which we're going to couple with that, is that organizations want long-term strategies, not just quick wins. Now, you could argue that at the start of everything changing last year, as it did so drastically, people had to go for some of the quick wins, but we've had time now to adapt our thought process around all of that, I suppose, and encourage our peers and colleagues to take a step back, think about that longer term strategy, and not go for the kind of quick and easy wins, which can be great in the short term, may not work out in the long term. So question for you here, Dara, is where's the best place to start? When we're thinking about adopting a zero trust security strategy, which, as we're seeing from these webinars we're hosting this week, if nothing else, where do you start? Because it touches on quite a variety of different technology areas there. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think to start off, it's about understanding that the best place to start is going to be different for every type of business, depending on where they're at with their zero trust strategy. And I think one thing we can provide today is a bit of a framework around how to understand in terms of identity and access maturity, and where you're at in terms of your zero trust maturity and that strategy as well. It's just a simple framework to be able to make that assessment now, and I guess have more data points to be able to make that assessment, because many of you already have a sense of where that might be already. So I think where to set the scene with that, though, is really around understanding that when we say the term zero trust, many different businesses are involved in zero trust projects, whether they identify them as being that or not. For example, if you ask somebody specifically, is your business involved in a zero trust strategy, and do you have a defined zero trust strategy? Very few people might say that they do. Very few security or IT professionals might say that they do. So beyond that, I think it's really just more about the intent that businesses come from when they try to adopt zero trust, which is about eliminating the need there for trust within that network architecture. And so that framework that I mentioned that I think might be helpful in understanding where to start, it's one that covers across various different stages. And so I can give you some insight into what those different stages are as a way to evaluate. And that can be a starting point. I think we've some suggestions towards the end as well, if it's something that you wanted to explore further and get a greater sense of confidence in making sure that you're on the right track when it comes to that. So I'll start at stage 0 here, for example. We're starting off with fragmented identity, for example. That's a sense where passwords might be everywhere for different separate applications, and you might not have a unified sense of user identity within the business. And those kinds of things can happen for a few ways, but ultimately passwords, if they exist across a variety of applications, they can create opportunities to introduce risk, because if those passwords are compromised on an individual basis, access to those applications will be compromised as well. And so ultimately, stage 0, our thoughts would be that the goal should be to move towards a future that's based on reducing or eliminating the need to have passwords. And that's something that naturally somebody like Okta can help with. If we move on to the first stage then, so this is a stage that many businesses are at. That's a stage where you've got single sign-on, you've got multi-factor authentication, and you're starting to apply them in different ways based on the level of assurance you need for different applications. So there's an extra level of assurance built in there, and you have the relevant policies set up in order to know which factors should be applied when. And so that's going to be a big improvement on stage 0. We're already reducing our need for passwords there too. And naturally, this is a high priority for businesses, especially as we're talking about with the theme of distributed work. People are logging in from potentially all over the world or all over the country. And so for businesses that didn't have single sign-on or didn't have multi-factor authentication, they definitely put some urgency towards making that a bigger priority. Beyond that, this is something that I touched on earlier, but it's the stage where contextual access comes in. And that's where we gather all the relevant risk signals to be able to determine what factor type to apply based on the level of assurance that we need. And all that context is there to give us an extra level of security. I think beyond that, though, an interesting conversation to have is one around efficiency as well. The way I would think of it is stage 2 is also about provisioning and deprovisioning and what we call at Okta the lifecycle management of employees within a business as well. So if the provisioning of certain applications is a manual step in many cases within the specific application, if we have ability to scale and automate how those applications are provisioned, so that when somebody starts on their first day, they have access to all the applications that they need. If they get promoted or they move roles, the applications that they don't need anymore are taken away. The new applications they need are automatically provisioned. And if they leave, we can deprovision access in bulk. I think these are extra levels of security where we don't introduce opportunities for access to certain assets to fall through the cracks, and then that way we have full visibility across the business when provisioning those different applications too. So last stage here that we'll suggest is stage 3, and that's where we take those risk signals, but instead of manually setting up the relevant priorities based on what we think the right access decisions should be, we can also leverage Okta's risk engine in order to do some of the behavioral profiling, detect anomalous behaviors, and then adapt the level of factor assurance we need based on how secure you want that application to be as a trade-off to what the user experience needs might be as well. Finding that balance is something that is a good mix and something to aim towards. So yeah, the distinction there, I think, is that if we aim to automate how those anomalous behaviors are detected, I think that's then another step up on top of what we had in the previous phase, which is one that's based on more fixed access policies that are a little less adaptable than what can be possible with Okta's behavioral profiling and risk scoring engine. So there's the 4 phases, and I think as a summary, if we're on the subject of where can we start with zero trust, it's about understanding what phase we're at, what phase we ultimately want to get to, and if it is something that I feel is interesting and relevant. Toby, I think something that you'd spoken to me about before, which is starting with a zero trust assessment, one where you can go through a formal questionnaire to assess what stage you're at and get a document that gives you a level of insight beyond what we might have time to share and talk about today. So yeah, to summarize that point, where to start with zero trust, I think it's find out where you're at in terms of identity and access maturity and zero trust maturity. And if you want to get to the next stage, the team at Bytes, the team at Okta, we're happy to help.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Dara. I love these sorts of slides because I think it is important that, yeah, appreciate that. Thank you. Stay on this one for a second, because I think these types of phased approaches are really important in implementing these types of technologies successfully, right? Because we have to appreciate, it's not a one size fits all. So it is very important to understand where you are today on this sliding scale so that we can adjust our approach accordingly, right? And for me personally, I think these types of projects start to become really compelling when you're striving to aim for at least stage 2, just my personal opinion there, because then you can really start to leverage the true power of these types of platforms when you look at things like automated provisioning and deprovisioning of licenses. And that's when it can become very compelling to not just your IT team, but wider business units around your organization as well will then start being very quickly interested in what these types of tools can do for them, for sure. But really good insight. Thanks for that, Dara. So that leads me nicely on to the next poll, which is asking you, the audience, as to where you think on this scale you are today, or indeed if you're not sure. And just while you're getting those answers in, Dara, you mentioned a very good point there at the end around the zero trust assessment, which is absolutely something that we can offer everyone on this call to help work out what that baseline looks like, where you are today. and we'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment as well. Dara, any more thoughts or points to raise from your side at all?
Not particularly, although I'm interested to see these results in that right now the majority seem to be at unified identity and access.
Yeah.
And the lifecycle management approach that you suggested around stage 2, I think is an interesting conversation to have. If those are manual steps, you can imagine what the risks can be if somebody, for example, even continues to have access to an application that they shouldn't if it wasn't deprovisioned correctly. So the automation that can be built in there, I think it can be really good for those who are interested. Yeah,
absolutely. I think you must have had your crystal ball out, because absolutely right. Most people are, it seems, at that stage 1, unified identity access management, which is a great position to be in, and certainly a great foundation to build upon as well if you do wish to further mature your posture in that area of security. So that's near enough it for ourselves and Okta today. Hope you've enjoyed the session. Couple of last polls, if you would indulge us, just for the end, is around the zero trust assessment. So engaging on that kind of self-assessment questionnaire style engagement to understand where you are today. There were a couple of unsures, I think, in that last poll. If you want to help, for us to help you understand where you are today, we can absolutely engage in that. I'll give that poll a moment to work its way through. And then I have one last question for you. Oh, it's actually on the same poll. So there you go, makes it nice and easy for you, which is around the identity workshops, which is taking a little bit of a step back from directly what we've spoken about today. But it's more around having a look at some of those wider elements that we've spoken about today, such as lifecycle management, other elements of identity as well, which perhaps for now fall out of Okta's direct remit. Apologies, Dara. But when we think about identity, we do consider the wider story, whether that's IAM, whether that's PAM, privileged account management tools, governance tools, etc. There's a lot to identity. So really those identity workshops are there to break that down and help you structure some form of strategy in that space as well. So polls are out. We'll leave you with those. Now, Q&A. We've had a few questions in. Dara, if you wouldn't mind helping us get to the bottom of some of these. And if anyone does have any others, keep them coming through in the chat box. We will see them, or we will get to them. But first up, Dara, question for you. Are Okta witnessing the same trends in the industry whereby workforces are transitioning to remote working?
Same trends in the industry. Yeah, I think transitions. Yeah, I think so. So I guess as a broader theme, many of us are adapting and getting used to working remotely. And I think a consequence of that is that businesses need a way to adapt and make sure that if their employees are logging in from home, for example, that they're doing so in a secure way. And sometimes that can mean things like having a way to recognize whether the device they're logging in from is secured. But as a trend, yeah, many of the conversations that we're having is about businesses realizing that if people are going to be everywhere, and I guess on the theme of what we're talking about with identity being the perimeter, how do we adapt that authentication process to make it a bit more secure? They're the types of conversations we're having day to day.
Perfect. Yeah. Got another question for you here as well. Where can I learn more to evaluate where my company is on the zero trust maturity curve? I think that may have come in before all our blurb around the zero trust assessment. So I'm pretty sure, Dara, correct me if I'm wrong, the answer to that will be zero trust assessment, and we can absolutely help you out with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to start, and it seems like there's definitely some interest there, and it's a good next step, I reckon.
Yeah, perfect. And one more for now is, what are the greatest challenges when adopting a zero trust infrastructure?
Sure. So this one is, I guess, a bit more subjective, and Toby, you might have some insight on this as well with the conversations you're having day to day. But I guess for me, one of the big advances that we're seeing a lot of interest from in Okta is about not needing to rely on the types of policies that are being configured to determine what level of access should be allowed, and instead allowing for something like Okta's risk engine to automate the evaluation of those types of authentication requests. I think it's a bigger task to decide on a per application or per asset by asset basis what type of policy you want applied and under what conditions. And so I think a simpler methodology for that to be applied in a way that's that gives you more assurance around security, I think is sometimes a better fit. So that's the challenge we're seeing, but I think Okta's had the ability to listen to that challenge, adapt, and then create a solution that fits with what customers are looking for.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose just from myself, something to add to that, a bit more flavor, I suppose, is zero trust can be deemed as almost a negative term, right? Zero trust in its by its very nature as a phrase suggests we're not trusting anyone. But actually, I think it's important when you are considering these types of projects where you're looking to change things up, looking to shake things up a little, and how people access, how people work. It's important to iterate to those users that actually it's not a lack of trust, as the name suggests, and it's not us as the organization trying to take things away from people. It can be about making their lives easier, whether it's giving them a single place to sign into, taking away the need for multiple credentials, whatever that might look like. It's actually about making their lives a bit easier, but also helping them appreciate that the business has an objective and a right, I suppose, to ensure that their infrastructure is secure. So by utilizing the right tools and phasing in those projects, a bit like that maturity scale we were looking at a moment ago, it's not like you're going to go all guns blazing from day one. It is about a phased, staggered approach typically to these types of projects, and I suppose easing these changes to their workflows in without trying to disrupt things too much, but whilst I suppose putting things into context for those users, right? So I think that's it for the questions, Dara. So we may be able to give everyone a bit of time back. Hopefully everyone's found that useful. If you do have any questions that come to you after the session, feel free to drop myself, your account manager, a line. More than happy to loop Dara into those conversations as well if you have any more questions for Dara or Okta in general. Other than that, really hope you enjoy any of the other sessions that you're signed up for throughout the week, and enjoy the rest of your day.